Detectives of Reddit. What are some of the creepiest cases you have worked on? Story 1. All right, detective now, but this happened when I was on patrol several years ago. Got a call to check the welfare of a guy whose neighbor hadn't seen him in a couple years. Why did it take so long to report? But it was out in a rural area. Anyway, we rolled up and the windows were black with mold and flies. Car is parked in the garage. No signs of forced entry. Breached the door and find said guy wrapped up in a phone cord beside a toppled chair in his dining room. He was mummified and melting into the carpet, barely recognizable as a human aside from his shape and clothes. The smell of him mingled with the inches of stagnant water in his basement from burst pipes and all the dead flies and mold. I'll never forget it. We also found 2 bags of groceries neatly packed on the floor in his kitchen. House was very tidy as well. No witnesses, estranged from his family. Clearly had a cat, but we never found its remains. Medical records indicated he had a heart condition. My theory is he was having a heart attack and tried to call 911, but never got to make the call. Perhaps the creepiest part? His mailbox was overflowing with past due bills and canceled utility notices. The last one was a couple months old, and it still took someone that long to call. Story 2. A buddy of mine worked on this. He said there was this guy who liked to shoot turtles on a pond on his property. He sees a turtle and shoots it 2 times with a .22 rifle. He had a hunting dog that would go fetch the turtles. He would make turtle soup with them. The dog goes out and gets the turtle, and an arm pops up. The turtle he shot was the back of the man's head, who was dead in the pond. The guy who fell into the pond might have had an accident or car trouble and slipped in the clay and hit the water at night, the day after Christmas while drunk. The cops rule it a drowning. The body had water in his lungs and his blood had pooled, lividity, at an angle due to him face down in the pond. There was a website that the parents had, couldn't find it, that said that the guy shooting the turtles murdered the guy by shooting him in the head and dumping him in the pond. Story 3. My brother, not me. I usually tell this long and dramatic, but here is the quick to the punch version. Schizophrenic woman reported being watched by ghosts at the abandoned funeral home. Turned out when investigating someone, or something dumb, was actually watching the people in her building, keeping crude logbooks of their coming and going, and left some of them in them. My brother's theory was that they were discovered, or almost discovered, and fled. Anyways, no idea what kind of crime was being planned, but that whole thing sounded creepy as crap to me. Story 4. Not a detective, but a forensic computer examiner for my local sheriff's department. I work closely with detectives and do lots of investigative work, so I feel I can accurately contribute to the conversation. Despite what the title suggests, a lot of my work is actually based on cell phone dump. I once got a request from a detective to dump a guy's phone because he was attempting to sell our county jail jumpsuits. Don't ask me why. I wouldn't know why anyone would want to buy one, or how he even got a hold of one. So I did what I'm supposed to and dumped his phone's data into a report for the detective to. Problem was, there was way more on the phone than what we had bargained for. Turns out the guy was really into underage girls, to the point that he had thousands of images, gross images on the device. So I called the detective up and informed him that he was going to need another warrant to cover the CP for the device. So he did and began creating a CP case against the guy. Several days later, it was time for the guy's prelim hearing for the county jumpsuit sales. He left the courthouse after the hearing and was immediately rearrested for the CP violations. He had a backpack on him with 3 more phones in it. I was given said phones to dump for the new CP case. Same amount of CP on all 3 devices as on the first one. This wasn't necessarily a super creepy, bone-chilling case, but it sure as hell makes you realize how much of that stuff is actually out there. And it's hidden in plain sight a lot of the time. Story 5. I have a couple that I was tangentially involved with. First one that comes to mind was this kid, a smart kid, a Chinese student coming to America for school on an engineering scholarship, I believe. Was dating a girl during undergrad, but they broke up so he could go to grad school at an Ivy League. She started talking to someone else a while after they broke up, and he caught wind of it. He bought an airsoft gun and some knives online. The next day, Air shipped them to his apartment, drove back to where his ex lived, and staked out her house, taking meticulous notes about the comings and goings when his ex was home, when her roommate was home. He went and knocked on the doors when just the roommate was home, brandished the airsoft gun like it was a BB gun, and negotiated his way in. He bound and gagged his roommate and waited for his ex to get back. When she finally got back, he forced her at gunpoint to sit in a chair, where he tied her up and taped over her mouth. He stabbed her in the neck once and then just stared at her, expecting that to end her instantly like a movie or video game. When it didn't, he stabbed her. I don't know how many more times, but a lot more. To me, the creepy part is the level of planning that he did. I can understand a crime of passion, but this was so dispassionate. To have enough time to order your murder weapons online and have them delivered, then drive hours to the destination of your murder and plan it out, and at no point get the feeling that you shouldn't follow through with this act. To me, that's the sign of a true sociopath. Story 6. I used to work with a retired LAPD beat cop of 30 years in his retirement fund money gig working on an ambulance. He told me the story that sent chills down my spine. He pulls over this sedan for expired tags, and neither the driver or passenger has any paperwork, driving illegally, and they're both acting shady as hell. So he calls for backup, detains them, and searches the car. He finds two dead young teenage girls in the trunk. They're naked, bound, and gagged, and had been mutilated. And there was tons of devices obviously meant for torture. He calls in the homicide detective, and the cavalry comes. The two guys are hauled away to jail, and his day wraps up after all the normal procedures and paperwork has been filed. And he says that was the last he ever heard of that case. Nothing. No subpoenas, no testimony to a grand jury, no interviews for the homicide detectives, no stories in the paper, nothing. He said it wasn't his normal area and didn't know the other cops and detectives that showed up, so that it's possible it just got lost in the enormity of the LA justice system. But he always wondered if there wasn't some shady crap going on. Story 7. My boyfriend was the detective in this. An officer doing a wellness check on an elderly woman spoke with her son. He said she was out at the moment, but she was doing well. He spoke in detail about what she was up to lately and all that. The officer noticed a strong smell coming from the yard, though. I'm sure you see where this is going, as I don't think pretending a deceased relative alive to keep receiving their benefits is uncommon. The officer turned the case over to a detective, my boyfriend, who returned with a warrant. There were two houses, a main house, and a small apartment-style house in the backyard where the mother once lived. When they entered, the son seemed calm, showed them right to the mother, continued to speak as if she was still alive and well. In the bed, they found the body that had clearly been there for a long time. It was like a putrid puddle. The stench was unbearable. The son adamantly refused that she was dead, insisting she had just been up and around the main house yesterday. I learned this story from my boyfriend as an explanation as to why he always uses so much cologne, air fresheners, scented fabric softeners, etc. The smell is apparently something you never forget. Story 8. Okay, here's a non-joke, but it's my husband's story. He is a detective. Someone dumped a body in an alley right by the PD, but in a spot that no one frequents. So after a few days in midsummer heat, the body melted so bad they couldn't ID by looks or tattoos, just the clothes and hair, and DNA once they figured out who she was. Long story short, it was a serial killer who had dumped her, and they found CCTV of him stalking people at the local shopping center right after he dumped the body. They watched him spend over 4 hours walking around, leaving his car and changing clothes, hat, and going back in, following women for a bit, changing his mind. He left empty-handed and ended up getting caught a couple states away the following week. Creepiest part for me was that I went shopping there the same day. Made me thankful for all the situational awareness training I got from my dad, also a detective. Made my husband more paranoid, but that's a different story. Story 9, I guess. Since OP forgot the serious tag, and literally no one has replied who is actually a detective yet. I used to work as an EMT. When I first started, I went on a prison call once. Our PT had a medical issue. And on the way to our patient, me and my partner witnessed another inmate eviscerate himself somehow. He was beating on his hospital cell door, screaming for painkillers, and how now y'all have to take me to the hospital. And the nurses, nonplussed, were like, yeah, we called someone, but don't sweat it. This is like the third time he's tried this. Also, we were warned not to try and go in and help him, because he would most certainly attack us. Dude has his intestines hanging out, and the entire staff seemed to think it was no big deal. Kinda crazy. I soon learned how messed up prison hospitals are. Eventually, I too became desensitized. Story 10. I've heard this one many times from the detective's friend, as it's the most told story. They were undercover in a mob and gathered enough evidence to search a house that the guys used a lot. The search led them to a basement filled with water halfway up the stairs. They shone flashlights and didn't see anything at first, then saw something glinting in the water. They turned to go up the stairs to get a brighter light, and along the walls and the door frame were gouges. The back of the door, too. They got their bright lights and went back down, and it turns out the bad guys had two crocodiles in there. And when someone pissed them off, they put them in the basement and locked the door. Gouges had skin particles in them. It was by far the craziest and creepiest case I heard, and there's quite a few cops in the family. Story 11. I was on the case to find the Miami Dolphins' missing mascot and quarterback, Dan Marino. During my investigation, I went eyeball to eyeball with a man-eating shark, staked out the Miami Dolphins, and met a beautiful girl named Einhorn. But I soon realized that the girl was the kidnapper, and the girl was hiding something. I stripped her of her clothes, revealing a large bulge tucked between her legs. That was the reason Podactor died. He discovered Einhorn's true identity and let out a scream before being shot off the balcony. Einhorn, Finkel, was arrested by the police after attacking me, and her ring is confirmed to have a missing stone. Marino and Snowflake were welcomed back during halftime at the Super Bowl. That's not even the craziest case. Wait till you hear about my trip to Africa. Story 12. Obligatory, not a cop, but a doctor who had a few fun forensics lectures back in med school. Forensics got called to a home after a few days. Police were called because of the smell. You probably already know where this is going. They arrived, found a dead guy, suspicious circumstances. The guy, around 40, was found dead in the bathtub, but not drowned, boiled to death. Eventually, they found out that he went out drinking. It was Carnival, the Germans and Dutchies will get it, and decided that he wanted to take a bath. Alcohol and the hot water must have made him sleepy, because he only turned on the hot water knob, passed out drunk, and then left the water running, which led to the water getting hotter and hotter, eventually basically boiling him to death. The worst part? When they tried to get him out of the bath, they basically just ripped his skin off of his body. They took a picture, and that's the one they used in our lecture. Fun. Story 13. All right, detective now, but this happened when I was on patrol several years ago. Got a call to check the welfare of a guy whose neighbor hadn't seen him in a couple years. Why did it take so long to report? But it was out in a rural area. Anyway, we rolled up and the windows were black with mold and flies. Car is parked in the garage. No signs of forced entry. Breach the door and find said guy, wrapped up in a phone cord beside a toppled chair in his dining room. He was mummified, melting into the carpet, barely recognizable as a human aside from his shape and clothes. The smell of him mingled with the inches of stagnant water in his basement, from burst pipes and all the dead flies and mold. And I'll never forget it. We also found 2 bags of groceries neatly packed on the floor in his kitchen. House was very tidy as well. No witnesses. Estranged from his family, clearly had a cat, but we never found its remains. Medical records indicated he had a heart condition. My theory is he was having a heart attack and tried to call 911, but never got to make the call. Perhaps the creepiest part? His mailbox was overflowing with past due bills and canceled utility notices. The last one was a couple months old, and it still took someone that long to call. Story 14. My uncle was a detective about 35 years ago. He was investigating a string of break-ins and discovered that a crackhead had burrowed a hole into the foundation of an apartment building in some dead space between footers. He was living there in a nest made from newspapers and random trash. Yes, like that X-Files episode. When 2 officers went to pull the guy out, the crackhead lashed out and started biting. Apparently as a defense mechanism, the crackhead started biting his own fingers off and spitting them at police. My uncle described the sound as biting into a cold carrot. When they finally got the guy out, he broke free and started climbing upstairs. He was still plus 100 strength on the ultra-buffing powers of crack. So he proceeded to pick up and throw one officer and my uncle over the stairwell. They eventually caught the guy. My uncle sustained a major injury and went on permanent disability. Story 15. Not a detective, but something did happen in my apartment society. It's a gated society with 5 buildings. And one morning there was a huge crowd in front of one of the buildings. Turns out that a woman had jumped from the 5th floor into the elevator lobby area around 3 in the morning or so. One of my friend's dad was first on the scene as he said that he heard a loud boom sound around that time and went to check it out. Here's where things get shady. The woman was living with her husband and MEL, and when people went to ask the MIL whether she could confirm that it was her son's wife, she looked over the edge of the 5th floor at the body below and said, "Oh yes, that's her," in a completely neutral tone. Local PD got suspicious and checked the lobby cameras for any clues. It turned out that the husband had tried to strangle her, rope marks on the neck, and then took her to the 9th floor and dropped her. The piece de resistance? The camera showed her slippers dropping a whole 5 minutes after her body hit the ground. The husband threw her off and skipped, and a background check revealed that this was his second marriage, and there were rumors that he and his mother burned his first wife alive. For a solid month or so, I had to escort residents to their homes because people in that building were terrified of what could happen. Story 16. I was a store detective, loss prevention. In my younger years, I covered a number of large outlet clothing stores in a region of my country. One particular Xmas period, we were having a serious problem with an organized gang of shoplifters. They were targeting several stores, taking thousands of dollars at a time. For reasons which later became clear, They were always one step ahead. They would always target stores which I had just left or was not at that particular day. One day, my ride broke down and I borrowed my cousin's car to get to work. Within 2 hours of my shift, I managed to apprehend the gang and recover a trolley with $2,500 of clothing. In an interview with the ringleader, he admitted his partner worked at one of the stores, and she had tipped him off regarding me, my vehicle, and license plate. Therefore, they had been looking for my car outside before targeting the stores. The female accomplice was sacked, and the other three went to court. Story 17. I'm a 911 dispatcher, but one of the strangest calls I've ever encountered was spooky. So I was working the TAC radio one night in Broward County at around 3 a.m. This was about 5 years ago, and an 18-wheeler slammed directly into a box truck as it was getting off of an exit on the highway. Now, this particular stretch of highway was very barren. The box truck damn near exploded, and the 18-wheeler chopped it in half. 3 people were trapped inside of the burning truck. According to the people in the truck, they were rescued by a man, and that man sat them all neatly on the side of the road and waited there with them until units arrived. Now, we sent the world to this accident, being that it was a vehicle fire with entrapment. Florida Highway came as well as about 3 different jurisdictions of police and fire. By the time they got there, it must have been over 100 units. A firefighter grabbed hold of the arm of the rescuer of the people to check him out. But when that firefighter turned around, the guy was gone. He vanished. We even had half of the units searching for him in case he was injured. No one ever saw that man ever again. Every time I tell this story, I get a mediocre reaction, but I'm telling you, man, it was spooky, like the guy was a ghost or spirit or something. Who rescued those people? Story 18. Does private detective count? My team and I were after a guy who was suspected to be scamming for workers' comp. Almost all our cases. For years. Except this guy was a fairly well-respected super handicapped archery champion. We watched him at a competition, taking forever to try and knock his arrow with a lame hand. From a stroke, from his wheelchair. Accident at work, can't walk. Then he got home, walked around his handicap van, got his wheelchair out of the van with the lift, and pushed the thing to his house with both hands. Some people suck. I mean, we knew something was not right, but nobody expected. And one time I had to verify the residency of a certain Middle Eastern dictator's former secretary, a few years before he was executed. I actually only found her house, but never saw her. He had tons of secretaries over the years, so there was no suspicion of anything weird going on. Just something that passed over my desk one day and thought it was slightly worth mentioning. Story 19, no longer a detective, so I feel like I can share. There was a really wealthy family in town. The grandfather was an author or a writer of some sort. He had built a legacy over the years. All of his family members were taking advantage of his wealth. He had a few kids. One daughter who worked in real estate. Her dad never trusted the guy she married. The middle child had passed away a few years prior, but his wife was still connected to the family. She was taking money from the grandfather and acting like it was for her daughter's college tuition. The youngest son worked for the publishing company he created. The whole family was just a mess, very dysfunctional, only really involved with the grandfather because of his money. As we learned more about the case, this became really obvious. Anyway, one night after a family gathering, the grandfather just ended his life. We were called to the scene to analyze the murder scene, blood spatter, etc. We ended up interviewing all of the family members. Took us a couple of days. It was a textbook case. The grandfather was getting up in age and didn't want to deal with the issues he was facing anymore. Then, out of nowhere, right when we were about to close the case, a random private investigator shows up. He ended up throwing everything we had already determined out the window. He hijacked the entire case. I've never been kicked off of a case before, especially from someone outside of the local office. Yet, there we were, being told what to do by a private investigator. Long story short, he found out the grandson had actually planned the old man's murder. Things didn't go as he planned, but after about 90 minutes, we finally were able to figure out what happened. Story 20. I worked in the major crime team for 6 years, dealt with many murders and abuses. There are a few in particular that disturbed me, and one ended in me having to leave my job that I loved. A 6-year-old boy with horrific head injuries caused by his father, who wanted revenge on his mother for having an affair, shot leaving him. A guy that tasered and then set his wife on fire because she was having an affair. A naive young mother who left her baby in the bath while having a glass of wine and chatting with neighbors. A whole family on holiday, bar one girl, who only survived because she hid under her dead mother's skirt for 8 hours, were wiped out as an apparent contract killing. This one is still unsolved, a fight. I can't really go into any further detail for obvious reasons. As an aside, the Millie Dollar job was pretty disturbing too. I didn't work it at the time it happened, but I did some clear-up work years later. Having access to all the statements and interview transcripts and so on was both a blessing and a curse. I was actually in a Crime Watch TV special on that case. My 2 seconds of fame, hey, all you see is me staring at the screen and chewing a pen, ha ha ha.